Okay, so when you are looking at an image in Camera Raw, there is, we've gone over your ability to make a bunch of changes to in Camera Raw with the exposure, with the color balance, and all that sort of stuff. However, sometimes you need to make some of those adjustments in Photoshop. Sometimes you need to adjust color. You need to adjust brightness, contrast, all sorts of things in Photoshop. Whether it's, as I'm going to show you, some special type things like you want to get rid of a certain specific color, which we're going to get rid of the yellow here on the chain links in a different demo. Or if it's just as simple as, it's still a little dark and you already went to open image, you've got it in Photoshop, and now you realize you need to make some changes, but you've already done a lot of editing in Photoshop and you don't want to go back to the camera and throw everything away, right? I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, that you might get into something and go, oh, you know what, it still needs a little bit more contrast. I need to, make some adjustments, but I don't want to go back to the Camera Raw version and make those adjustments because I've edited in Photoshop for a while. So what you can do is we've got these things called adjustment layers, and you'll see they're right here, okay? And these are really, really cool. And one of the reasons why they're cool is they give you the ability to infinitely adjust your photographs without ever having to worry about actually changing the image in a way that is permanent, okay? Because these adjustments come in the form of a layer in Photoshop. So let's just say with this image that I wanted to do some changing by making it a little colder. Let's say even I wanted to go with what we might call a monochromatic look. Okay, so just at a, just where I'm just throwing this out there, I'm doing this as I'm coming up with this as I go along. So what I can do is there's an adjustment layer called hue and saturation. Now I'm not going to go through all of them for you. I'm going to let you explore them a little bit on your own, but I just want to show you how they work. So we're going to stack them too, because that's one of the second things that's really important about these things, is they're stackable. So let's just say you wanted to make an image a certain color. This is, she's kind of dressed in its cold weather, and maybe we wanted to make the whole image kind of bluish. And I mean all blue. So it's not just making it black and white, but we want it to be all blues, no reds, no browns, nothing in this image. So what I can do is I can go over here to the hue saturation adjustment layer. I'm going to click on it, and you'll see down here in the layers palette, you can see that a new adjustment or a new layer pops up. And that adjustment layer affects everything that's below it, except, and we'll deal with the except in a second. So right now, I can actually shift this image along the rainbow. And it's actually literally just going to change all the colors along the rainbow, which is kind of cool. Or I can also control the saturation. So let's go full screen here so we can see better. If I increase the saturation, you can see how the colors become super crazy saturated, okay, get they really deep. Or I can go the other way around and decrease the saturation to the point where it goes all the way to basically a black and white image. You can also increase the lightness or the darkness of the image. Now, if my first inclination is actually to go black and white, there's even a better thing than just the hue saturation, so let's trash this layer. And what's cool is, now notice that it pops back. So you're not actually ever adjusting or changing the layer that's underneath there. It's just saving the changes that you're making into its own layer. This is, as I said a little bit, just a few minutes ago, this is very powerful. So what I'm going to do is there's actually a black and white adjustment layer here that allows you to fine-tune, just like in Camera Raw, how bright certain colors are. So I can push the reds up. I can take the yellows are, oh, yeah, they are working a little bit. So take the yellows up, take the greens down, make a little bit more contrast. I can really play with whether I want things brighter or darker. So now what we might want to do is then we'll add in our own color on top of that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add another adjustment layer. Now, whenever you're clicked on an adjustment layer, up here in the adjustments palette is what you've selected. If I want to go back and I want to add a new one, I can do one of two things. I can click off of this and then I can add another one. But the problem with that is that it will then pop up in between these two. We actually want it to be above, and you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to click back on this, and then there's a little arrow here. We're going to click on that. That gets us back to the list. And then I'm just going to add a color balance. Now the color balance is really cool because what it'll allow me to do is it'll allow me to boost colors into my shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's just say I wanted this to kind of be a little bit of a cooler image, you know, go with the blue colors. So what I can do now is I can start to push blues into my midtones here, and maybe just add a touch of cyan, and you can kind of see how my midtones are now, you know, blues only. I might leave my highlights and my shadows completely untouched, because it's nice that the midtones have color, but the shadows and the highlights are neutral gray, black and white. They're neutral completely. But if I didn't want to do that and I wanted to add tones, okay, I can do that by just going and clicking on the highlights, and then I can add blues into the highlights. You can see how the highlights are now going blue, okay, and cyan go green, okay. I mean, you can, you know, obviously you can make more subtle changes are usually, you know, the better changes, but sometimes you might want to go a little bit more extreme, I guess is what I'm trying to say, but usually you want to go subtle. And that's why with something like this, I kind of like the highlights being more neutral, you know, more of a black and white neutral look, and then just my midtones being colored. I might even try pumping some blues into my shadow areas, just a touch, okay? There's a whole ton of them. Now, let's take a look at what happens if I flip-flop the order of these adjustment layers, okay? Just to kind of show you this, because the order does matter. In fact, it's extraordinarily important. If I take the color balance and drag it underneath, now notice all of a sudden all the color goes away. Can anybody guess why that happens? I've given you enough information now that you should be able to figure it out. What layers, if we take a look here, we've got our black and white layer on top, and then the color balance underneath it, and then the layer zeros underneath that. I told you that the layers affect everything that's underneath it. So what's happening here? Well, not our hue and sat. We deleted the hue and saturation, but you're right. The black and white filter is now taking out the colors that I made in the color balance. So if I turn these off, watch. If I turn them off and then I'll progress upwards, I click the color balance, well, it's doing its job. The problem is that I put the black and white in on top of it, and now the black and white's taking out all the colors. If, however, I flip my color balance and put it up on top, now what happens is the black and white affects the layer below it, boom, and then the color balance affects the layers below that, boom. See? Pretty cool, okay? Now, some of you might ask, well, that's great, Mr. Weisbrod, but what if I want to affect only one layer, okay? You know, let's say you've got multiple layers and you want to do this to only one layer. I don't have a really great example in the photographs that I chose to show you here, but that's easy, actually. All you need to do is there's a button right here. It's got these circles right here, and if you hover over it, it'll say, this adjustment affects all layers below. Clip to layer. So if you click this on both of these, now what it means is it's only going to affect this layer directly below it. And so if you had other layers that were underneath this, which wouldn't matter because they wouldn't show because this layer is, you know, fully opaque, but let's say you did, these two adjustment layers would not affect that layer. Okay? So this is a good way if you've started to edit a photograph, and then all of a sudden you realize your photograph needs some different colors, or it needs some contrast, or it needs to lighten up the midtones a little bit. Okay, you can do that. So for instance, here's another one of my favorites, the curves layer. The curves layer is awesome. And I just drag that up to the top here. The curves layer gives you basically like a bar graph of your image. So down here are my shadows and up here are my highlights. And you can see I've got a lot of shadows in here and a decent amount of midtones, but not a lot of highlights. Well, that makes a lot of sense based on the image, because look at all the darks that we've got here, right? If I turn these two off, you can watch the histogram change. See that? So my change in color balance changes that, which is kind of cool. But what I can also do is I can adjust this very nicely by going in, and let's say I just wanted to lift my midtones up a little bit to make them a little bit lighter. I click in the middle of the curve here. This is why it's called curves. And I can lift this up. Now what's really neat about it is it doesn't change where my highlights are, nor does it change where my shadows are. It just allows me to make adjustments. And I can continue adding, I can do some crazy stuff with it, okay? But I can continue adding points and changing highlights, flattening them out. You know, here's my high mids, so I can bring a little bit of tone back into her face there. Bring the midtones back down or back up, okay? You can kind of see what I can do. If I bring my highlights down like this, you'll see that they're going to start going gray. See how they have a nasty gray tone to them? However, if I go this way, you'll see that I can start to blast them out. Whoops, now it's starting to go a little weird, but the more I move it to the left, the brighter those highlights get, and they start to get really blasted. So it's probably pretty good where they are. And you do the same thing with the shadows. If I bring the shadow point over here, okay, see how the blacks start to get blocked up and really dark, and then they jump straight into the mid-blacks, and then, oh, notice we got a little spike here. Control that. Okay? Too many points can cause a problem, but, you know, this is a good one for controlling your exposure if you want to as well. So you've got a lot of control in these things, in these adjustment layers. Let me just say that what I've taught you before, however, still holds true. If you can make all of your adjustments in Camera Raw before you move into Photoshop, you're doing a better job, because Camera Raw gives you the ability to make a lot of adjustments without completely destroying the quality of the image. One of the things that you're going to notice here, see these gaps in the histogram here, okay? Notice that if I turn off my other two layers, those gaps, whoops, those gaps go away. See that? I mean, the whole thing changes, but you notice there's no more gaps. Once you start adjusting with the adjustment layers, a lot of times you are throwing out colors. You're throwing out information, and you're creating gaps in your information. So technically, by doing this, I've technically at least reduced the quality of the image. I've thrown out some colors, and there's a pretty decent number of them here, okay? And you can see here as well. So you want to be careful with this. If you do that with Camera Raw, you wouldn't be throwing out as many colors, if any at all, because the Camera Raw, that file has a lot more colors, basically. That's a really bad way of putting it, but it's true. So that you have more room to adjust with Camera Raw. You keep your quality better with Camera Raw, okay? So whatever controls and changes you can make to Camera Raw, do it, okay? Any questions about that? No? All right, hold on a second.